Hi everybody. Alright, let's just cover a couple things really quick. Firstly, if you've got a cell phone with you, can you please put it on vibrate or on silent so that we don't disturb the other participants. For those of you who are in the back, I know it's like church, the back always fills up first, but we do have a lot of good seats here and the air conditioning is a little bit cooler up here in the front of the hall. Alright, thank you very much. Tonight's talk is forced landings. And a forced landing is what we're going to talk about because, trust us, it's something you never really want to have to experience for yourself. My name is Roscoe, and like many of you, I'm a pilot, and I'm also crazy enough to be an airplane owner. Now, to be perfectly honest, my first flight instructor said that I was obsessed with flying. And I've got to tell you, he was right. I really do like aviation. It came to me at a point in my life where it just really changed the direction of my life, and I have been thoroughly enjoying it ever since. Just like you, I do like aviation, I do like my aircraft, and I'm sort of a joiner. I have joined the OX5 crew, I'm a member of EAA, I'm a member of AOPA, the AYA, and several other organizations related to aviation. So now you know I really am crazy about aviation. Let me say this, as an airplane owner, and I'm plugging type clubs tonight as part of our talk, is that type clubs provide quite a bit of useful information for the type of aircraft you own. I mean, for some aircraft owners, like the Grummans, they show up at a field and most people mistake them for an RV. Hey, is that the new RV-10? No, actually it's a Grumman Cheetah. But you have a variety of type clubs. There's a type club for Moonies, Beechcraft, Cessna, and several segments of Cessna, the straight tail 172s, the 120s, the 140 Society, the American Bonanza Society. Type clubs are really good for you. Their dues are usually quite minimal, $40 to $60 a year, and you get that back in information that you save, glean from the magazine that comes out monthly or bi-monthly. The typical type club is safer than the general fleet. Now there must be a reason for that. And it's usually because the program, they have a safety program or something involved in that. But there's a lot that a type club brings to the organization. It brings information, scarce parts, maintenance tips. It frequently has programs for insurance, for safety, historical archives, as well as maintenance experts that you may need. Well worth the yearly dues, and many hold annual convention as well as regional fly-ins. Now, having put that plug in for type clubs, why would I plug type clubs? It's because as I was preparing this talk, I gathered information from a couple of type clubs, and one in particular shared a lot of their safety information with me, which allowed me to construct this talk. Okay, so now that we've booked for type clubs, we're going to talk tonight about forced landings, and that said, I like participation. Participation in my audience is fun. It lets me know what's on your mind, it gives me the drift of what you're thinking, and it allows me to force the conversation back to areas where you have some questions or maybe not quite firmed up on the information yet. So again, speak up. We will also have a question and answer section here at the end. Like most of us as pilots, we start out with our private pilot's license, and then we may pursue an instrument rating, maybe even perhaps a commercial ticket. But eventually we reach a comfort zone and then we settle in. We do the same stuff. Once a month we fly out for the $100 hamburger, maybe the $50 breakfast. We take the kids down to grandma's, we go shopping someplace, but we get into the same basic rut of flying. We do the same different things. We're no longer really broadening our envelope of exposure. We're not chasing ratings, we're not adding new types, we're just flying our airplane in our good comfort zone. But even for those of us who operate in a comfort zone, we eventually get to a point where we arrive at becoming a better pilot and a safer pilot. Now these two words are not interchangeable. You can be a very safe pilot and not be a very good pilot. You can be an excellent pilot and be thoroughly unsafe. What we'd like to have is both together. Safety is why we are here tonight and why we're going to learn. Now, aviation is filled with all manner of expressions. We've heard many of them. Flight instructors start us out fairly early. You know, for every landing for every takeoff there is a landing. Well, the one I want you to remember for tonight is this. Learn from the mistakes of others. You can't possibly live long enough to make them all yourself. That's key to tonight's talk. Let's see what we can glean from our discussion tonight. We're going to cover forced landings. Now, a forced landing differs from a precautionary landing in that the engine is not producing power at all. You know you're going to land, but where? How long do you have? What are you going to do? So we find ourselves suddenly in a glider. What to do? Well, flight instruction taught us. Aviate, navigate, communicate. So the first thing we want to do, we want to fly the airplane. All right, we're not producing power, but we still have altitude, which buys us some flying time. We want to navigate to a place of landing, and we'd like to communicate those intentions to somebody. Now, aviation safety is a flyer that comes out in the mail, and they advertise, and they send out the pilot's list. And they sent out a little short sheet to put in your flight bag a few weeks ago, and it was called Aviation Safety's 13 Lucky Steps to a Forced Landing. Let's review the 13 steps from aviation safety. The first thing they ask us to do is to compare our ground speed to true airspeed. Now, what is this telling us? This is telling us something about our relationship to our course over ground and the wind. Then they'd like us to compare our GPS heading to our directional gyro to find the crosswind and the strength. We're going to land, we need to know something about the wind. Now we turn our attention to finding an airport, a deserted road, or a field if possible, keeping in mind that the best landing spot may already be behind us, so keep that in mind. Now, an airport is ideal to land at. A deserted road or a field, they're not equal. In my book, I would say a deserted road, I mean no power lines, no fences, no street signs, is a better field, is a better landing zone than a field, because soybean, cotton, corn, just about anything that grows in a field is going to tear the heck out of the wings and the tail when it brushes up against the airplane at landing speed. So, deserted road in my book over a field. Okay, now that we've decided where we're going and we've picked out where we're trying to navigate to for landing, now we need to do some cockpit management here in the very beginning. First off, seat belts as tight as you can stand. You want to guard against a jar on injury. You should stow loose objects if you have them. Hopefully you keep your cockpit fairly organized when you fly, and this one becomes a push. Once your landing is made and you know you're going to hit the spot you were aiming for, you should slow your sink speed to roughly 1.2 times the clean stall speed. For most aircraft that stall at 60 to 65, this is somewhere in the range of 73 to 77 miles an hour. Gives you your minimum sink so you contact the ground as gently as possible. If you have time, give an accurate position report to ATC. Put your flaps to full to slow your speed. And then landing gear is a toss-up. If you've got fixed gear, you're not going to put them up. If you've got retractable gear, you'll have to decide whether to put them down for the landing or leave them up and belly in. Then you should try to relax. I know it sounds disheartening. You've got a million things going on, your heart's racing. Believe it or not, the adrenaline really hasn't kicked in yet. So take a moment, calm yourself, and really prepare for the landing. Turn off your electrics, shut off your fuel, crack your door or canopy if you have it. And then finally, cushion your face with a pillow, folded jacket, or blanket. Now this is what aviation safety recommends for achieving a good forced landing. So what we'd like to do tonight is, from this type club, we are going to examine 3 such scenarios in light of these steps. And then we're going to examine see how much time each pilot have, how they react to this, and what we might glean from these experiences. Now, let me tell you a few things about these scenarios. First, for each of these scenarios, there were no injuries, not even a scratch from the 3 different aircraft. Second, all pilots were current with over 1,000 hours in type. And third, these pilots participate in their type club. 2 of them were actively involved in the total refurbishment of their aircraft. 1 even actually won Best of Show in his aircraft 3 days before his forced landing. So they were all familiar with their aircraft. They knew its performance. They knew its quirks. They were all involved with the safety program of their type club, as well as the FAA Wings program and others such as this talk. So let's examine the 3 scenarios. Pilot number 1, South Florida. Coming into St. Augustine, actually northern Florida, coming into St. Augustine, enters the pattern on direction of tower, does a base, turns a half-mile final. About a quarter mile out, he realizes he needs to add a little power. Engine's at idle. He goes to shove the throttle in to make the landing zone and finds out his engine is going to give him no more power. For some reason, his throttle is no longer connected to the carburetor. So he realizes he's actually going to fall short. He has pilot number 1 about 20 seconds before ground contact. What does he do? Well, according to pilot number 1, he shut off his electric, he shut off his fuel, he cracked his canopy, He tightened up his seatbelts as much as he could, and he grabbed something heavy to break a window in case he flipped over, because if you know St. Augustine, it's saltwater marsh on the approach end. And that's exactly 300 feet short of the runway. He packed it into saltwater marsh, the landing gear caught in the mud, the aircraft stood up on its nose, and he thought for a minute it was going to settle back down, but it did eventually flip over, dropping the canopy section of the aircraft into dark, muddy water. And good thing he had his hand on something heavy, was able to undo his seatbelts, break out a window, climb out through the mud, and walk up to the end of the runway. Okay, now, why did his airplane not produce power? Okay, who can tell me the relevance of service bulletins? That's right, service bulletins are issued by the manufacturer, but for Part 91 operations that you and I fly mostly, a service bulletin is not mandatory. As any newly minted A&P will tell you, the only time that a service bulletin is mandatory for Part 91 is when it is called out in an AD. So there was a service bulletin for this aircraft on the particular throttle linkage. It said that the trailer ball and hitch assembly could wear over time and come loose at a critical moment. So the service bulletin asked for two things. One, you replace it with a new part that actually has a bolt that is keepered on. And secondly, a return spring on the throttle, so that should the throttle come off the throttle, that the throttle would be engaged by the spring to go full power, so you have power, not be at idle. Now, again, not mandatory. So pilot number one never installed the service bulletin. Loss of an aircraft, badly damaged the aircraft, about $85,000, and quite a bit of wounded pride. So we can learn something from service bulletins. Not to add insult to injury, but a review of the service bulletin. The part change on the throttle assembly for the carburetor, folks, $3.36. You can't go in a fast food restaurant and get a sandwich for that in most places. $3.36. Time to change, 2 to 5 minutes. Could have saved a damage to an aircraft and quite a bit of wounded pride. Okay, pilot number two. Now, back to pilot number one for just a second. So, when pilot number one lost his power, actually he still had idle power, but he was going to land and short of the field, he had about 20 seconds to make his decision. 20 seconds. You never know when it's going to hit you. Okay, pilot number two. Traveling cross country, had made 3 fuel stops already that day, well-maintained aircraft, had just landed in Iowa for fuel, had taken off field elevation about 2,200 feet, and was on autopilot in a full power climb up through 2,500, chewing up the ground at about 140 knots, when he heard and he felt the engine roll back. Scan of the gauges revealed that the oil pressure had fallen out of the green and was falling in the yellow, and it was headed towards zero. Oil temperature was pegged. Pilot reduced throttle, killed the climb, went full rich on all the mixture. Tried to cool the engine. It continued. The oil pressure continued to fall. Eventually hitting zero. A couple of seconds thereafter, tappet noise, and then a couple of seconds after that, a loud clank and a bang, and through a connecting rod, and the engine came to a complete and abrupt stop in a couple of blade ticks. Boom, 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 boom. Big finger sticking up there. Pilot now has 2,000 feet of altitude, roughly about 2 minutes to make his decision of where he's going to land. Okay, so first thing he did was he had a choice of a busy road, soybean fields, took the deserted road. There were no fences, no street signs. It was about 1.5 miles long, and it didn't have the gully the field did. Took the field, made a normal landing, and walked off the airplane and checked the engine compartment. Now, were there any clues to what was going on in this aircraft? Well, he had noticed that the oil temperature was slightly above where it had been, that there was a slight vibration for the last couple hours in the engine that was getting progressively worse, but it was still pretty minor. Oil consumption was up a bit, meaning that in 4 hours of flight where he normally used half a quart, he now used a quart. But what eventually was diagnosed upon the teardown of the engine is that he had spun a bearing, and the bearing had been extruded from lack of oil, and then when that done, all loss of oil pressure to the system was lost. It was being pumped out the bad bearing, causing that bearing to fail, throw a connecting rod, and stop the engine. From an insurance standpoint, not a scratch to the aircraft. The owner's out an engine, but the insurance company doesn't have to pay out a penny. Okay? Scenario number two, 2 minutes to adjust. Just about enough time that you might get into a panic mode. Something to consider. And then finally, the third pilot is in cruise flight at 8,500 feet. Ground elevation is about 2,500 feet. So he's over northern Texas. 6,000 feet above the ground, on autopilot, flying along, when all of a sudden, the engine stops. It's windmilling, but it's not producing power. A quick scan of the gauges revealed fuel pressure is 0. He hits the electric fuel pump for boost, fuel pressure still remains 0. He immediately turns towards the nearest airport at best speed of glide for his aircraft, 80 miles an hour. And what he finds he has a busy road and a very busy fairgrounds that he knows he could make, and lots of cotton fields as a backup plan. So, not to endanger innocent people on the ground, he actually chooses the cotton field, where he puts the airplane down, pretty much destroying the wings and the tail section. He and his passengers step out, not a scratch to them. Now, the aftermath. What actually went wrong? Well, the fuel pump in an aircraft has 2 diaphragms. The upper diaphragm broke, pumping the fuel out the overflow line. So when he hit the electric fuel pump to generate fuel pressure, it just pumped more fuel overboard even faster. Now, here's the takeaway from this whole lesson in terms of fuel starvation. If you've got a primer in your aircraft, your primer is not connected to your fuel selector valve. It is directly connected to one of your 2 tanks. And in most aircraft, it's the left fuel tank. So if you lose your mechanical fuel pump and you lose your electric fuel pump, you still have the primer, if you've got fuel in that tank, that you can actually work the primer and actually provide power to the engine. It's not going to run perfectly, but it's going to produce thrust and it's going to keep you into the air. As I talked with members of the Type Club, I actually talked to one of their gurus out on the West Coast, and he said that once he actually lost a fuel pump in an aircraft, and between him and his passenger taking 2-minute turns on the primer, they were actually able to fly for over 20 minutes over Puget Sound, getting it back to their base field and putting the aircraft down safely. So your primer in your aircraft is a 3rd source of fuel. Okay? Now, let's examine something that's common to all 3 of these. First off, all the members of these aircraft were members of the Type Club. They all attend the yearly conventions, the regional fly-ins, and the maintenance talks. Matter of fact, 2 of the pilots had actually attended a forced landing seminar at a safety seminar just a couple of days prior to their unfortunate event. Almost like writing on the wall. What they all recommended that you do is that once they were on the ground, they actually recommended that you stop, get a piece of paper and a pencil, and write down what happened. As you best remember it right then when it's fresh in your mind. Because you're going to have to tell it over and over. First off, they're going to be the emergency personnel who show up. They're going to want to check you for blood pressure and pulse. Then there's going to be law enforcement. There may be NTSB and FAA. And then there's always, inevitably, your aircraft transport. Here's another little takeaway from pilot number 2. Put his airplane down quite safely on a deserted dirt road that went between 2 soybean fields. This is the road where the tractors go when they go to harvest the crop. Now, runways in Alaska were in worse case than that road, but yet the emergency personnel kept making a big deal of that. Did you hit your head? They also wanted the aircraft pushed back into a gate hole. So if you are offered the opportunity to have volunteers help you move your aircraft, it would behoove you to pick a couple of volunteers and show them exactly where to hold your aircraft, where to push. It does no good to put an $80,000 aircraft down safely and then have well-meaning but misguided hands crinkle the skin and cause thousands of dollars of repair. So help them when it comes time to move your aircraft. Okay, forced landings. You can survive it. It's not something comfortable, but it should be part of our regular training. We should train for the eventualities. I feel fairly fortunate that I had a very young Dutch flight instructor when I learned to fly back in the 90s in southern Mississippi. His pet peeve was forced landings. He always made me have a spot in my mind. I mean, even during my primary training, he'd pull the mixture and go, "Where are you going to land?" And I better have a spot picked out. So just subconsciously, I always, every 2 to 3 minutes, pick out a spot and say, if I lose my engine right now, that's where I'm going. Whether it's an airport, it's a good road, or it's a field that's barren of crops. Okay. I actually hope that each of you can take away something from this seminar tonight. I'd like to thank you for both your attention and your participation. I'd like to thank Aviation Safety for their little flyer, which inspired this talk. I'd like to thank Kevin Murphy for this opportunity. Kevin, I wish I really had a real audience. I'm really great in front of a crowd. Folks, this has been a Lighted Toybox production. You can reach us at 513-519-7008. I'd like to thank each of you again, and good night. We will take questions now, please.